Ladies and gentlemen, I am Mr. Shevchenko on behalf of the Media Ukraine Center and Ukrinform. I welcome all the journalists telling the world about the Ukrainian fight for freedom. Today we are talking about the tax reform that is now developed by the presidential office and other stakeholders at the governmental level. Why is it that we are talking about this at the Ukraine Media Center and Ukrinform? This is because this is a matter of national security, and this will be the key for Ukrainian society building back better. I give the floor to Rostyslav Shurma, the deputy head of the Office of the President of Ukraine. The floor is yours, sir. Welcome, everybody. Perhaps I will begin with short introductory words, and we will have enough time to interactively work with you and answer all the questions. Now, of course, after the war is over and the victory has been secured, we are envisaging a full-scale program of Ukrainian recovery, including the flow of money from business, entrepreneurship, society, and this is in general a matter to increase the Ukrainians' future. We've been critically analyzing the situation as of now, and something that we can offer to the world and to the Ukrainian society, the business circles, both medium scale and large scale. What do we see now? What we're seeing now is that any state, any enterprise are competing with each other, and taxation system is one of the products that any company takes into account when they calculate their plans for the future in terms of placing their headquarters and their facilities. We are all aware that we should offer something to the business society of the world, something that is at the level of our international competitors. This is one way to look at the draft tax reform. And we are comparing our ideas about the foreigners, the Eastern European countries that have been successful in major breakthroughs. They have opened a lot of headquarters of major companies. So we are looking at the business environment, including the different taxes. For example, the income tax. What is it? This is an income and the taxes that the companies will face. What we see around us, Romania is 10%, Bulgaria 10% income tax, Hungary 9% of income tax, Poland the taxation for the medium and larger scale companies, and so on. The list goes on and on. We should think about what we can offer. Correspondingly, we are talking about the ballpark of 10%, 8%, somewhere up to 12%. This is one way to look at it. The other thing is the trade activities. We want these enterprises to be placed in Ukraine rather than trading here in Ukraine and having their headquarters in Singapore or elsewhere. This would mean that the income tax will be paid over there. If we look at the countries that offer different conditions for trade activities, we should look at Switzerland, for example. Canton is different, but in general is 6% on average. What we see that this is the range for us to look into, about 10% in general for us to be competitive and to be attractive for the companies to invest into Ukraine, not for them to think about relocating their business to other jurisdictions. This invites a question: what is the practice? What is the expertise here? There are a couple of good cases, in particular Ireland, a country that has been decreasing taxation from 50% down to 12.5%. which is reforming root and branch. Accordingly, it has brought a lot of economic activity. Cyprus is another example. Very successful case. Cyprus was facing quite a daunting challenge, something similar to ours. They began with a 30% tax. The country was invaded. We're talking about the northern Cyprus. Then they brought the taxation rate to 10%. Numbers were different, but we are talking about five-fold decrease. At the fundamentally constructive approach, this model seems to be working. Another taxation is the income tax. No one is talking about that openly, but what we now know that Ukrainians are taxed at the level of quite increased 22%, then 18% and 5% of military levies. Taken together, if we compare what the employee is receiving and the taxation level of the employer, we will see that it amounts to something to 51%. That is to say, to pay 20,000 hryvnias, the taxation levy and taxation burden for the employer is about 12 to up to 11,000, which is almost half of the salary. Not surprisingly, that explains the fact of the shadowy schemes. And of course, this is quite a high taxation levy. Such a rate in general in Europe is up to 30%. Of course, somewhere we have 20%. In other countries, north of 40%. But in the developed world, where there is no deficit in the labor market, but there is a deficit of the personal market, the tax rates are much lower. Here, the taxation level is very relatively high. It calls for fundamental reform. There's another point which has to do with history. The VAT, what is it? It's when a consumer is taxed that every one of us is paying. When you pay for some goods, you are paying VAT to prevent excessive consumption. But in reality, what we see that the effective rate in the European Union, not the nominal one, but the effective one, is at the level of 10%, to be precise, from 6 to 7% to 13%. In Switzerland, it's the lowest, almost 7%. The highest seems to be in Croatia, up somewhere in the vicinity of 13%. But 9 to 11% is the average number, because there are a lot of exemptions, different ways to do that. For example, if the nominal rate is up to 27%, there is a range of products that are levied at a lower level. Germany, for example, the nominal rate is 18%. If you look at the shopping center, to put it into simple terms, 80% of the consumer basket by the consumer is levied at the level of 7%. Accordingly, 80% of that amounts to 9% at the end of the day. What we see is that when we compare our situation with other countries of the European Union, countries that are our competitors in terms of creating jobs, the system of taxation, their system is much more loyal to the customer, which means we should introduce specific changes. Another way to look at the tax reform is this: the corruption and the need for anti-corruption steps. Such taxation rate and the tradition where we were functioning for the last 30 years has spread a Byzantine system of taxation. These taxes include only nominally, but 90% of businesses, in one way or the other, are trying to optimize their taxation procedures. Sometimes they evade, sometimes that's called optimization. But for the state, it means that the budget of the country does not receive taxation. The brightest example is the payment for the jobs, for the employees. The 7 to 8% goes to the intermediary who are providing their services to get the money out of the country through different channels, either through private enterprise schemes or buying some sham schemes. At the end of the day, the state receives nothing into the budget, but the intermediary gets their share at the level of 8%. Over the years and even decades, we have seen a lot of leaders at the taxation system level, but fundamentally nothing has changed. We saw some progress, some going back, but because of the integrated nature of the fiscal system and law enforcement system into this so-called optimization system of taxation, now anti-corruption approach will deprive the motivation to evade paying taxation. Of course, it will deliver the 10 to 15% to the state budget rather than having nominal rate at 51%, receiving nothing to the state budget and paying their share of income to the intermediary. Our figures say that up to 90% of Ukrainian businesses, when they are taxed 10 to 15%, it seems plausible that they will be paying all their employees in a legitimate way. That would mean that the state budget will grow manyfold. Why is it? When we look at the brightest figures, for example, in the budget sector, the unified social contribution, all of us are aware that in the state sector of economy, we employ about 20% of all the Ukrainian market force. At the same time, the government sector provides a lot of jobs, meaning that the private sector pays better than the state sector does, which creates some disbalance here and some questions how the payment for the salary system is working. VAT, how do we deal with that? The simplest way is to do what they do with the European Union. They have the basic rate at the level of 20-21%, with the exemption of 80% of the food basket. In Bulgaria, it's nothing, nil. In Italy, it's 3%, 7% in Germany, 5% in Poland and Hungary. What is the risk here? The risk is that all this infrastructure of optimizing taxation in Ukraine will provide quite other services, and they will provide for the transition from one way of avoiding taxes to another form. Now, to have this tax reform implemented, we should get rid of all the stimuli to optimize taxation and for the corruption not to take place. We believe that the lower tax rate is the best way to go forward, to make sure that the government institutions are working good without any element of corruption. And if there is no demand for specific services, the business will grow to the fact that they have to pay taxes anyway, rather than looking for the way of avoiding taxes. That's one point.
Well, the third component is that we understand how complicated is the circumstances the business end up in currently and how difficult it will be to rebuild the country for us. So within the transition period of this reconstruction, 5 to 7 years, we should probably provide more loyal conditions for business than other competing countries. And I'm talking about the all regulatory environment here and tax area in specific. So this tax system will look quite loyal in the background of other competing countries, and we understand for sure that it will be economically and logically justified, so that there are relevant stimuli for reconstruction of our country. And the last very important context, we understand it quite clearly that one way or another we have to retain the budget proceeds. We cannot admit in circumstances of war, the tax proceeds to fall down because we have to fund our military spending. So we have to create the proper architecture and the model in terms of jobs payment and taxation of investments and income. But we have to impose temporarily tax within this transition period, either the turnover tax or retail operations tax, which would provide the same level of proceeds in the balance in the joint budget, so there is no gap, at least until the end of the war. And it will allow business to go out of shadow so they can bear those expenses to optimize the tax and pay everything to the state budget. We modeled it in detail, not only in format of the unified budget, but also in terms of budgets and local budgets, so that we make sure that there is no gap in any component, so that there is compensation for balancing of all that. And what's almost utmostly important is that the implementation of such principal tax reform is only possible after entering into some social agreement with the business. If we provide such conditions, we all have to agree that nobody is involved in tax optimization, and those who do should be liable in terms of access to information. So there is zero stimuli, zero desire to get involved in such practice. In short, that's it in terms of presentation. I'm ready to answer the questions as to the calculations, mechanism, and all. I have one question before there are questions from the floor. We know that this reform already became the subject to the profound discussion in the team itself, and what we see in the mass media, the critics of these reforms. There are some in the Ministry of Finance who should take care of the budget proceeds, and the head of a parliamentary committee, Mr. Hetmantsev. And we hear that this reform will make the budget proceeds fall. You already answered this question in the beginning of your presentation, but generally, what's your answer to such critics? Look, it's not about critics, but it's about tax model. It's very complex matter. And it's difficult to expect that in this society there will be a full consensus among specialists in terms of its implementation. Everybody has their own stance. Let's break it down to the components. For example, the Ministry of Finance is absolutely normal, natural reaction of Ministry of Finance of any country and any Minister of Finance. I know no single example when the Minister of Finance would support any tax lower in practice, and that's a normal reaction. And the main thing is for us to proceed to the normal constructive discussion to find out that formula which would allow us to retain the budget proceeds, but at the same time to change the landscape for business, to replace the imaginary rates, to have them replaced with the real rates, which would work. We already started this dialogue, and I'm convinced we will find compromise. And another very important thing is our international partners. I would like to segregate International Monetary Fund, which thinks in standards and stencils, which were worked out in their practice before. The situation is standard. If there is a war, the taxes should be growing. But again, everybody who lives in our country, let's admit that we will comply with those recommendations. What will it result in? It will result in only growing number of businesses going into shadow. Who is satisfied with the tax situation here? We have 20 people in the studio here, and they all may say that they receive their salaries completely in white, but I doubt it. I don't think that we would like to retain the system as it is now. It's a chance to fundamentally change everything. The International Monetary Fund and other foreign partners, they don't fully understand the specific nature of operation of our economy. they should get deeper into details, and we will submerge them into details to get them convinced. Also, there are much talks about the standards of the European Union, about 15% rate, or OECD 15% rate. But again, there is another but. There is a EU directive which contemplates the basic 15% rate. But in practice, we see that there is no single EU country with an effective rate above 13%, and in some countries it's below 10%. So we will find compromise with our partners, and we will not put the integration to European Union into jeopardy. So there might be a model with a basic rate, but there might be an exemption for basic products, and this EU practice may operate, but it will not be the best way out of the situation in our case. So for the transitional period, we would better impose this temporary rate, and then we will switch to the differentiated rate according to European practice. As to the OECD practice on taxation of businesses, there might be a number of exemptions, temporary or permanent, and our country, which is fighting for the freedom of the whole world, has a moral right to bring up this question during the period of rebuilding of our country, to impose 5 to 7% rate to raise more investments. Pavlo Kalashnik, Likanet, you mentioned that if we implement this system, the budget proceeds will grow times. Do you have any fundamental research how it would happen? Not so it doesn't. So it's not only worse. Well, I didn't say it will grow times, but I mentioned the world experience when some countries who undertook this type of reforms, they had a significant growth of budget proceeds. For example, Ireland and Cyprus. Another good example is Bulgaria, which is who imposed 10-10-10 tax system during the financial crisis, when tax proceeds should be falling, and International Monetary Fund was strictly against it. But thanks to the businesses coming out of shadow, the budget proceeds grew 37% and another 14% for the next year, and the third year it was 7 to 8% growth. Talking about what I said about Ukraine, that during the first year we should rebuild the model with the calculations so we don't lose any tax proceeds starting from the year one. And we should balance it with a temporary tax related to funding of the warfare. As to the long-term effect, such models are usually based on certain assumptions of the economic growth and the shadowing of economy, and upon certain structural reforms will receive the economic growth of 7+%, and obviously it would result in the growth of budget proceeds. There are models like this. They are all based on certain calculations and assumptions, and we may organize the expert discussion on this topic shortly. I would also like to ask, you already answered about Ministry of Finance and IMF. The Office of President, in the press release, it said that Office of the President develops this project. So you said you expect some constructive discussion with the Ministry of Finance, so it means that there is no such discussion currently. Well, look, there is a dialogue with the Ministry of Finance, and there will be a compromise found and certain consensus. Why is it? Because there is a demand on the end of the society, and there is task set by the president to prepare the reform in the anti-corruption area. So together we will work this issue out. So let's let other journalists ask questions too, and then we will get back to you. Good afternoon, Mr. Rostyslav, Ukrainian Center of Control over Tobacco, Dmitro Baslavsky. You said that there is a tax reform being prepared by the Office of the President. Does it contemplate the increase of the excise tax? You didn't mention it. Now the cigarettes are cheaper than in the other EU countries, even in the supermarkets. Is there any increase of the excise tax contemplated, because now that the cigarette price fell significantly? Well, I'll start with a more conceptual answer. One of the compensatory mechanisms that we envisage, there is a number of such indicators. So it's a taxation of the harmful consumption. It's tobacco, alcohol, and fuel. In this case, we will impose the tax similar to the average European rate. Another important matter is the administration of such taxes. You know that in case of tobacco, the illegal circulation of tobacco products is up to 30%, which is very important. In case of alcohol, it's even bigger. So very important issue is the administration of such taxes, and we plan two fundamental changes in administration of such changes. First of all, it's electronic excise. It's not when those excise stamps are being put on the cigarette packs, but it will use the unique QR code, which will allow to track where this pack or bottle was manufactured, in which warehouse it was stored, and was the logistic chain, how it is being delivered to the consumers. And we will be able to track, is it the original QR code, or it's abused by the manufacturer who steals the money from the consumer without paying it to the budget, because excise tax is finally paid by the consumer. So if today is the price of the pack of cigarettes is 50 hryvnias, well, even 70 hryvnias, we understand that 50 hryvnias of them are the excise tax. If the consumer is levied those 50 hryvnias, but they don't go to the budget, but they rather go to the pocket of the counterfeit product manufacturer, the citizen will have a big question about that. Another concept, we didn't take the decisions so far, but to have this system work, we have to transfer the payment for these excise tax products into non-cash payment. So they only should be paid with cards. Just like in case with the fuel suppliers switched to card payments completely, and the consumer felt uncomfortable maybe within a week or two, but everybody got adapted to these new technologies, and it allowed to renew the circulation of fuel, so to say. And this is something that will happen to tobacco or alcohol, because the nature and the possibility of evasion of excise tax will disappear. And the third thing about the tax rate for the tobacco products, I think that, today there is already a gradual roadmap approved for increase, 7 years plan of the excise tax growth, like 7% year by year, which would lead to the balancing of the excise tax based on the average European rate. In view of devaluation, we will review it, and we will do it shortly. I think that I answered your question in complex.
Oksana Polishuk, Ukrinform. Sir, will you tell us how your reform will impact the quality of the optimization services? Either this will be the schemes, and what will be the most challenging task here? I will begin with the general picture. Our logic is this: we know the value and the price of every reform on the market. All the taxation rate will only be higher 2 to 3 % higher than the cost of the services. The entrepreneurs always ask one question: do I save a couple of hryvnias and then will be charged with some criminal investigations? That's why the general logic is at this. Second point, we believe that the cash operation must be taxed, for example, for judicial persons. This will mean the increase of the cost of services. Every optimization provides and is based on the flow of cash. And the third point is the specific examples. For example, the use of private enterprises. If we have some checks in place, for example, outflow of money from the organization level to the personal level, then the cost for such services will be a couple of percentage points higher. For the enterprises, there will be still available an opportunity to use them as they have been doing so far, but it will not be profitable to use them for the paying of their personnel or employees without full taxation. Channel 1+1. In your presentation, I go back to 1 year ago when this reform was being talked about. It was then called 10-10-10 at the basic rate. I believe from this 10-10-10 you are now reneging on that and you suggest something new. No, we are not going back on that, but 10% is not a dogma in itself. We understand that there is a compromise at the level of 9 to 11%, but this is not an end in itself. We believe that this general number, 10%, is something that we will end up with in any case. When we took into consideration some countries that I mentioned, when we talk about the cost of optimization, we also see that 7 to 8 to 10%, it's not that much higher to make sure that the businesses go from under the shadow. But again, 10% is not something that is set in stone. And I don't say that the 10% will be there, for example, for the time of the military martial law. But the principle must be there. The principle is to be competitive amongst other countries, to introduce anti-corruption measures, to ensure that there are no stimuli to evade taxation. And the third point is to balance the state budget beginning from the initial year of the reform. Maxim Zborovsky, the Rada TV channel. What are the international partners that you are negotiating with, apart from the IMF? And what is their take? We are in close cooperation with the IMF because this is a key stakeholder in this issue, although unfortunately IMF is not a key donor. If you look at the structure of the financial assistance to Ukraine, the IMF's share is somewhere near zero. If it's not zero absolute, it's less than 10%. But this organization is most active in this project. We believe that the most fundamental thing is to agree our steps with the IMF, because this is an organization that sets the template. And of course, we have begun discussions with the European Commission, plus all the Ukrainian donors. We believe this is the way to follow. We are receiving tens of billions of hryvnias, and we should not ignore the possible consensus with our major donors. It will take some time, perhaps longer than we would like it to do, but we think this is a polite and a decent way to treat our partners who are helping us. More questions? Going back to the IMF issue, you mentioned the zero, and we are also saying that IMF is the body that all of us are looking up to. And we are now in negotiation with a massive program of help. If this taxation reform on the agenda with the IMF talks, and talking about the template that you mentioned, IMF is always against the major state budget deficit, something that Ukraine is now going through. Because of the help from the international donors, we are trying our best to make that deficit as low as we can. But what will happen post-war? What do you say to the IMF? How you are going to cover the state budget deficit? I think that is the key indicator for them. And another point is that, to the best of my knowledge, one of the conditions by the IMF for this facility to work is to change this private entrepreneur taxation modes, 5% for the private entrepreneurs, something that they will never agree with. Let's go step by step. First, today we have a signed memorandum that will be running for 3 to 4 months. This is a monitoring program, a program that envisages the doing away with this private enterprise institution with the 5% never mentioned, either at the first stage or at the second page. This will be lost. As for the specific program of financial assistance and the conditions, we are not in that stage yet. We hope that we will begin such negotiations very soon. Once we have started on that road, we will be talking about the taxation reform. As for the budget deficit, let me underline the following. We should be comparing apples with apples. If we allow this today's system of taxation be retained, the state budget deficit will be massive. We cannot bring the taxation from 1%, 51% to more than 100% for the workforce. So we should be comparing relative things. Our challenge is to do the following. In the wake of the reform, the state budget revenues should not be following. But once we see the radical economic flow and growth, that will be different. Under the current circumstances, this is not possible. We are in the circle that is circling around itself. This is a vicious circle, but the economic growth is something that will be providing us an opportunity for the post-war economic growth. And when the subsidies, massive subsidies and massive assistance to cover the Ukrainian state budget deficit. Another question, when do you think you will submit these draft laws to the parliament? I believe that these conceptions will be submitted to parliament once we have agreed them with the international partners. I cannot forecast this, whether it'll take months or years, but we are very ambitious in our plans. At the end of the day, we will see what has happened by then. I have a final question, and this is quite different topic. You have come back from the World Economic Forum in Davos, and I think it was very important for Ukraine to send the right messages to the business world community. The world is very anxious about the economic slowdown. What was your message to the world business circles? The war and the geopolitical changes that we are seeing now indeed are opening up new challenges and new opportunities for our country and for the business around the world. In energy sector, for example, we are seeing the energy map of the world is changing. It has traditionally been based on the Russian fuel supplies. This will have to change, not with the fossil fuel, but rather with the new green technologies, including the European Union. This will boil down to the new modes of energy production in machine building everywhere, or in the chemistry sector. The world today is dependent very seriously on the Chinese produce. That's why the world is looking anxiously to diversify the supply chains. This is where Ukraine comes into play. What we have seen is something new. Over the last 2 decades of my expertise of talking to international businesses, I have seen for the first time by the corporation, by specific persons, to Ukraine. And that is explained by the fact that Ukraine is facing new perspective, and the world businesses are also looking forward to new opportunities. To make sure that the international business come to Ukraine, we must introduce some structural changes. Rule of law, total and principal fight against corruption, and as a component of the fight against corruption is the new tax system. Why is it? Because no Western large company will be engaging in the optimization of the taxes. They are legitimately and legally paying all the taxes, and when next door to you there's another company that is optimizing their taxation, this is not a level playing ground. For example, when we begin the recovery of Ukraine, we'll be fighting for the capital, for the workforce. If I pay a 51% of my payment burden and my competitor pays 7% because they are engaged in hiding schemes, who will get a more and a larger workforce? They will, of course, attract more people. An experienced and great big company will avoid Ukraine. They will try to come here. They will see what's going on, and they will boil down their activities, leading to other companies to avoid Ukrainian market. But we want to make sure that Ukraine is attractive to the world market. What have you been impressed mostly by at Davos? I was surprised, shall I put it, by the drastically new view of the Russia-Ukraine war. As a rule, business tries to be not engaged in politics. I remember the Davos previous meetings when people try to avoid talking about the politics. Now we see that they have been radically changed. The businesses are now aware that this is not a war of Ukraine against Russia. This is a turning point in the world history, indicating a new direction for the world to grow, whether the businesses that have been built over hundreds of years, whether they will stay afloat after the end of the Ukraine-Russia war. We have been talking to Rostyslav, Shurma, Deputy Head of the Office of the President of Ukraine, hot-footed from Davos. Thank you very much. I invite you to keep track of our events. Stand with Ukraine. Thank you. And glory to Ukraine.